Now here's a question for y'all. Have you ever tried to win an argument among your friends by throwing blood at them? That's right, blood. Hey, I told you too this wasn't a children's channel.
It's time for another episode of the History Behind the Headlines.
What's up, guys? Well, this is an article in the Montgomery News that talks about Benjamin Franklin's newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, and how he made money by running advertisements about the slave industry. But it also mentions this interesting fact that Benjamin Franklin, who was a printer, also printed the renowned book of an anti-slavery crusader, Benjamin Lay. And it says here he was a revolutionary Quaker who Franklin visited at his cave abode. Now, the interesting thing about Benjamin Lay is that there's not much else said here, but he is certainly far more interesting and deserves much more attention than the paragraph he gets in this story. So we're going to give Benjamin Lay more than a paragraph as we focus on his incredible life in this video and a little bit about Benjamin Franklin as well. So who exactly was Benjamin Lay? Benjamin Lay was a deeply religious anti-slavery activist in colonial America who died before the start of the American Revolution. If you've never heard of him, you're not alone. Many people haven't. In terms of abolitionists, you might be more familiar with names like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. Benjamin Lay labored before these better-known abolitionists appeared on the scene. Now, Benjamin Lay was born to Quaker parents 338 years ago on January 26, 1682 in England. Now, this is interesting. When Benjamin Lay was just 1 year old, his contemporary, William Penn, was founding the Pennsylvania colony, which was the 12th of the original 13 colonies in North America. Like Benjamin Lay, William Penn was a Quaker. So they were both Quakers at a time when Quakers were widely persecuted for their faith. You see, Quakers believe in the inner light, the idea that God is in everyone. In other words, Quakers are much more likely to emphasize the individual as opposed to the authority of the church. Other Protestants viewed Quakers as having a lesser view of the importance of the church in a Christian's life compared to their high view of the church. But these were different times when the concept of religious toleration was still very much in its infancy. So these weren't just friendly disagreements, which meant that if you were a Quaker in early America, boy, you were just asking for trouble. For example, Plymouth Colony was very aggressive in trying to stop Quakers from entering their colony in Massachusetts. Anyone who tried to help them, such as hiding Quakers in their homes, could also be prosecuted under the law. In late 1656 and 1657, Massachusetts passed a series of laws that outlawed, quote, the cursed sect of heretics commonly called Quakers, unquote. In fact, in one decade in the 1660s, there were 37 convictions, 34 of which occurred in the year 1660 alone. And by the way, Quakers was originally a derogatory term. Since they originally broke off from the Church of England, a Church of England official said their punishment would be so severe they would quake with fear, hence the term Quakers. So what could be worse than being part of this persecuted religious sect? Well, being kicked out by this persecuted religious sect. And that's kind of what the Quakers did to Benjamin Lay when they made it clear to him that he was unwelcome in their future business meeting. It turns out Benjamin Lay was even too radical for the outlawed Quakers. And in his fight against slavery, Benjamin Lay could be very radical. So now listen to this. This is going to blow your mind. The Smithsonian Magazine recounts one radical episode where Benjamin Lay at a Quaker meeting in September 1738 unleashes on his fellow Society of Friends members. He came in wearing a coat, where he hid a military uniform and a sword, and he carried a hollowed out book with a secret compartment, which he had prepared a bladder. He put blood, or rather red pokeberry juice, in an animal bladder, which he tied up. And then he stood up at some point in the meeting in a loud voice, proclaiming God Almighty respects all peoples equally, rich, poor, men, women, white, and black alike. He says slave keeping is the greatest sin in the whole world. And then he asked the fellow members there, the friends, how can they keep slaves? That's when he threw open his coat, revealing the military clothing, the book, and the blade, the book representing the Bible. And he says, thus God shed the blood of those persons who enslave their fellow creatures. And he pulls out the sword, raises the book above his head, plunges the sword through it. People are shocked as the red liquid gushes down his arm, and blood, quote unquote, splatters on the slave keepers. It's a prophecy, a dark, violent future for those Quakers in attendance at the meeting. Another story is told about Benjamin Lay in a different time, standing out in the cold like this, the dead of winter, much like I am, with the only exception being that, unlike me, he isn't wearing a coat. And he's got one foot buried barefoot in the snow. You'll have to imagine that. And as people noticed and walked by and took concern, saying, "Are you all right? Are you okay?" That's when Benjamin Lay dived into his point. He said slaves have to work in these similar conditions, in the cold, in the snow, with no coat and no boot. With so many pro-slavery people alive at this time, why did Benjamin Lay see life so differently? We can trace many important influences in his life. For a while, he lived on the Caribbean island of Barbados. It was in Barbados where he was appalled by the mistreatment of enslaved people. As a seaman, Benjamin Lay was also shocked by the stories told by other sailors on the numbers of Africans who died before they could complete the transatlantic voyage. He was on a ship traveling from England with sailors once who gave such horrible details of the abuse inflicted on the Negroes that it made the slave trade seem, quote, more awful and bestial character than Benjamin had ever imagined belonged to it. Now, Benjamin Lay was also influenced by the writings of a handful of abolitionist writings of his time, including a book by Ralph Sandiford, who was a merchant in Philadelphia. Now, Sandiford's book was titled A Brief Examination of the Practice of the Times, and it was published in 1729. Now, the year 1729 is also significant because that's when Benjamin Franklin, famous for flying his kite in a thunderstorm, begins publishing the Pennsylvania Gazette. 6 years following 1729, Benjamin Franklin himself begins owning slaves. Like most people in his time, Ben Franklin considers Africans to be inferior to Europeans. It would be another couple of decades before Benjamin Franklin begins to change his views regarding slavery. His Pennsylvania Gazette made money running ads on slave auctions and notices on runaway slaves, but Franklin's printing press also published anti-slavery literature. When Benjamin Franklin visited a school for black children, he was impressed. In 1763, almost 30 years after he first owned slaves, he reached a different conclusion. he now believed that African shortcomings and ignorance were not inherently natural, but come from lack of education, slavery, and negative environments. Ralph Sandiford wrote, "What greater injustice can be acted than to rob a man of his liberty, which is more valuable than life? And especially after such a manner as this, to take a man from his native country, his parents and brethren, and other natural enjoyments, and to sell them." Sandiford then goes on to call the slave trade evil. He rejects the contemporary argument that slavery is a good way to bring the Christian gospel to the heathens. That's just wrong, he says, because he states the slave trade is causing the name of God to be profaned. In fact, slavery does not help to spread the gospel of Christ among non-Christians, Sandiford argues, because slavery contradicts the gospel of Christ. He reserves his strongest criticism for the quote-unquote Negro masters, calling them out because they pretend to be sons of God. They're not. They're fake. Why? He cites Old Testament book of Exodus, chapter 21, verse 16, and says, quote, "The law of God expressly forbids either the stealing of men or the receiving of them under the penalty of death." And he goes on and on like this in his book, citing numerous passages from both the Old and New Testament to support his claims. The Bible, in other words, considers slavery a sin. For Sandiford, if you want to spread the gospel of Christ among enslaved blacks, you must set them free. Now, the anti-slavery literature would so impact Benjamin Lay that he would write his own book against slavery in 1737. Now, interestingly, Benjamin Lay's book was published by Ben Franklin. And Benjamin Lay, in his book, cites other popular anti-slavery literature in circulation at the time. So he's reading these abolitionists and he's praising the abolitionists, especially Ralph Sandiford, amongst many others, who has written excellently well against that filthy sin of slavery. He also wrote this about Ralph Sandiford, quote, "I have read his book carefully with attention, and I do not remember a word in it contrary to truth, as may easily be found in Holy Scripture, both Old and New Testament." Now, Benjamin Lay appeals to his pacifism to argue against slavery. Quakers, of course, have long history of being pacifists. That is, many Quakers have a commitment to nonviolence and a conscientious objection to participating in war, although some do serve in the military. Now, Benjamin Lay calls pacifist Quakers hypocrites because it's hypocritical to be against taking up arms to fight in wars while buying enslaved people who are obtained through war. He also asks, how would they like it if they were removed from their native countries, from their wives and children, and sold into slavery? Now, for Benjamin Lay, slavery was the defining issue of his day. In 1737, he called the slave trade, quote, "the grossest iniquity in the whole world. There could be nothing worse. It's the greatest sin, the greatest wickedness." He tells the slave-holding Quakers that they themselves are captives, for they that keep captives are in captivity and bondage to sin. Worse still, their influence brings many of their friends, male and female, into bondage because of their sin and continuing in it. Now, he does tackle different pro-slavery arguments too, which you can read in the link provided, but he says rather than keeping slaves and defending slavery, which he calls a vile and shameless practice, Quakers ought to separate themselves from those who participate in the slave trade, especially ministers and elders whose example is 10 times worse than the others. In the 17th century, Benjamin Lay is arguing that Christians are, quote, "being led into it," that is, in slavery, "by the foul example of their preachers and leaders, which have caused them to err." Benjamin Lay argues that the corrupting influence of these leaders spreads like leprosy, and it can even touch atheists, he says. That's because an atheist might look at this so-called worthy leaders among the Quakers and begin to think, why shouldn't I profit from the slave trade like them too? He states that it is most lamentable to think how in taking Negroes out of Africa and selling them there, telling them here, that which God has joined together, men do boldly render asunder. Men from their country, husbands from their wives, parents from their children. How horrible is the uncleanliness, mortality, if not murder, that the ships are guilty of that bring great crowds of these miserable men and women. His anti-slavery book is published nearly 40 years before the Quakers officially declared that participation in the slave trade among their members was wrong. But just to further emphasize just how far ahead of his time Benjamin Lay was, consider that his book was published before America abolished the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. And he includes in his book a hope and a warning. Now keep in mind, this was written nearly 40 years before the Declaration of Independence in 1776. 40 years before that. Quote, I heartily wish we might be brought to see this sin as great and as dangerous as it really is, both in church and state, in ministers and hearers, that we might with one accord, by fasting and prayer, in spirit and in truth, night and day, in public and private, seek to and beseech the Almighty Lord of heaven and earth, that he would be pleased to assist us with strength and courage to make war with and engage against so capital an enemy that is so dishonorable to God and all true religion, destructive to government and mankind in general. Benjamin Lay is someone you should know. Perhaps he was a maniac, as one historian called him. Or perhaps he was a kind of a future boy, way ahead of his time, with a warning for early America. For though his little stunt with the blood and the talk of a day of judgment coming upon slaveholders was considered extreme, the words seem eerily prophetic, foreshadowing a time when this peculiar institution would plunge the American nation into a bloody 4-year civil war. Well, guys, that's all I have for now. So thank you for watching. And if you'd like to know more, be sure to read the notes that I left in the description with some links for additional information. Also, feel free to comment. I do want to know what you think, any thoughts that you might have. I'm looking forward to learning from you as well. And if you have some questions, go ahead and leave it there. And also, I'll have a new video soon. In the meantime, if you want to make your life more pleasurable, feel free to hit the subscribe button. And remember, the past is never dead. It isn't even past.